He slammed the medical file onto the conference table so hard the glass cracked. "Baron," Kang Do-shik's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Your woman is barren, and you call yourself a boss?" Naomi Brooks sat perfectly still in her chair, hands folded in her lap, face composed into something that had cost her everything she had left. The document was face up. Her name was on the top. Her diagnosis, printed in cold clinical English, was now visible to every man in that room. She had never told a single person in this building, not one. Someone had gone through her private medical records. Someone had paid to destroy her. If you've ever had your most private wound ripped open in front of strangers, if you've ever sat in a room where powerful people were deciding your worth, then you already know exactly what was running through Naomi Brooks's chest in that moment. And if you're watching right now, don't go anywhere. Hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because the stories we tell here don't let you breathe easy, and you do not want to walk into the next one cold. This is the story of a woman who believed she had nothing left to offer, and a man who looked at her broken truth and said the one word she never expected. The file had been sitting on Naomi's kitchen counter for 11 days before she opened it. That's not something people talk about. How long you can live beside bad news before you let it in. She'd carried it home from the clinic in a white envelope with the hospital's name printed in blue across the front, and she'd put it on the counter next to her coffee maker. And every morning she'd looked at it while the water heated and told herself she'd read it tomorrow. She was a financial archivist. She worked with documents for a living. She understood, better than most, that paper held permanence, that once something was written down, it became real in a way that couldn't be walked back. So she waited 11 days. On the 12th morning, she poured her coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened the envelope. She read the whole report twice. Then she folded it carefully back into thirds, slid it into the envelope, and set it on the counter again. She finished her coffee. She washed the mug. She put on her coat and took the subway to Beko Logistics, where she had 17 boxes of shipping manifests from 2009 to 2014 waiting to be digitized. She was very good at finishing what she started. Naomi had arrived in Seoul 8 months earlier on a short-term contract with a records management firm out of Atlanta. She'd expected 6 months, maybe 7. The Beko Logistics account was supposed to be straightforward. Decades of paper records that the company's compliance division needed converted to searchable digital format before a regulatory audit. Nobody at her firm had told her much about Beko Logistics. The pay was exceptional. The workspace was private. The staff was professional in the way that people are professional when they've been trained to be, not because they naturally are. She figured it out gradually. The kind of money flowing through a mid-sized shipping company's books didn't match the physical footprint. There were holding companies folded inside holding companies. Certain account numbers appeared in documentation that predated the company's official founding by 4 years. Some of the shipping manifests described cargo weights that didn't match the vessel capacities listed. Naomi noted these things. She documented them carefully in her own private log, separate from her official work files. And she kept digitizing. She was not naive. She was cautious in the way that intelligent women who have spent careers working inside powerful institutions learn to be. She identified the boundaries of what she'd been hired to do, and she stayed inside them, and she kept her eyes open. It was Kang Tae-jun who complicated everything. What? She met him on her 3rd week. He'd come into the records room himself. Unusual, since most of the senior leadership communicated through assistants, and stood at the door watching her work for almost a full minute before she noticed him. She didn't startle. That was the first thing he remarked on. "Most people flinch when they realize I'm standing there," he said. Naomi set her scanner down and looked at him directly. He was tall for a Korean man, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm. It came from absolute certainty that the room would adjust itself to him, not the other way around. She recognized that kind of person. She'd worked for several of them. "Should I have flinched?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like a recalibration. "No," he said. "You probably shouldn't." He stayed 40 minutes and asked her almost nothing about the work. He asked where she was from, whether she'd eaten, whether the lighting in the records room gave her headaches the way it gave everyone else headaches. He asked if she'd seen anything of the city beyond the subway and the office building. She told him she hadn't had time. He looked at the stacks of boxes surrounding her and said, "There's a lot of them." "There's 17 more in storage," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you good at keeping things to yourself?" Naomi met his eyes and held them. "It's the only reason anyone hires me." He nodded once and left. Awesome. What happened between that conversation and the present moment, the 8 months that followed, is the kind of thing that Naomi hadn't expected and couldn't entirely explain, even to herself. She was not a woman who fell easily. She'd had relationships. She'd loved one man, badly, in her late 20s, and she'd learned from it the particular discipline of not letting feeling outrun judgment. She was good at that discipline. She'd practiced it. Tin undid it carefully, without appearing to try. He didn't pursue her in the way that powerful men usually pursued women they wanted, with money or access, or the implicit understanding that they were doing you a favor by noticing you. He showed up. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He brought her coffee when he came to check on the project, always the same kind after she mentioned once that she preferred Americano to anything sweet, and never acknowledged that he'd remembered. He told her the truth about things in a way that most people didn't. Not everything. She understood there were things he would never tell her and probably shouldn't, but about himself, about the weight he carried, about what the Beko name cost him in sleep, and in the parts of himself he'd had to shut down to do what he did. He talked about those things plainly, without performing either regret or pride. She fell in love with him the way you fall into something you didn't see coming. Slowly at first, and then all at once. And by the time you recognize it, you're already in it. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she'd finish the contract, go back to Atlanta, and the whole thing would fold into memory. Then the clinic envelope arrived. Severe endometriosis. Advanced polycystic ovarian syndrome. The fertility specialist had used words like irreversible and permanent, and I want to be honest with you about your options. The report was thorough. It did not leave much room for alternative interpretation. Naomi sat with it for 11 days. On the 12th, she read it and went to work and digitized 2 full boxes of manifests and ate lunch alone at her desk and did not cry, because she had learned a long time ago that crying at work was a kind of wound you couldn't close back up once you'd opened it. She cried at home, later. That was allowed. She gave herself the evening for it. She sat on the bathroom floor with her back against the tub and felt the full weight of it. Not just the medical reality, but everything it meant, the futures it closed off, the particular grief of losing something you hadn't even known you were still hoping for. Then she got up, washed her face, made tea, and started thinking practically. Taejun had never directly said anything about children, but she knew enough about what he was, about what the Beko name required, about the expectations that moved through organizations like his, like water through rock, slow, persistent, reshaping everything eventually. A man in his position needed an heir. That wasn't sentiment, that was structure. She could not give him one. And so she began, quietly and methodically, to pack. She was careful about it. She didn't want to cause a scene. She didn't want to have an argument that she'd already had with herself 100 times over and settled. She booked a flight back to Atlanta. She drafted a professional resignation letter to the records management firm, citing personal matters. She started consolidating her files at Baeko, making sure her replacement would be able to pick up the project without losing a week of work. She was 3 days from her flight when Taejun walked into the records room and found her closing up the last of her personal items. He stood in the doorway. He looked at the box in her hands and the almost empty desk behind her, and then back at her face, and she watched him read the situation in about 4 seconds. Naomi. Just her name. Just that. But the way he said it, like something in his chest had seized and he was fighting to keep his voice level, stopped her where she stood. "I need to tell you something," she said. She'd rehearsed this. She'd rehearsed it carefully because she knew herself well enough to know that if she didn't have the words ready, the feelings would take over, and she couldn't afford that. "I received medical results a few weeks ago. I should have told you sooner. I didn't know how." He crossed the room slowly and stood 3 feet from her. He didn't reach for her. He just waited, and the quality of his waiting, total and absolute, like he had all the time in the world and nothing mattered more than this, made her chest ache. She told him. All of it. The diagnosis, the specialist's assessment, what it meant and what it didn't, and what she had decided because of it. She kept her voice steady. She'd had 11 days plus 3 more to get herself to steady. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Taejun looked at her for a long moment. His expression was difficult to read, not because he was hiding it, but because whatever was happening behind his eyes was complicated enough that it didn't translate cleanly to his face. Then he said it. Good. Naomi stared at him. The word landed so strangely, so utterly wrong in context, so far from anything she'd prepared for, that her rehearsed composure simply fell apart. Not into tears, into confusion so complete that she had nothing left to stand behind. What? He exhaled. Not with relief exactly, more like a man who had been holding a breath for years and had finally remembered how lungs worked. Sit down, he said. Please, I need to tell you something too. She sat. He stood at first, then seemed to decide that standing was wrong for this, and pulled a chair close and sat across from her with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and his eyes on the floor for a moment before he raised them to her. My father, he said, killed 14 people before he was 25. Not for the organization, not for business, because he enjoyed it. The room was very still. My grandfather was worse. The things he did. There are men in this organization who knew him and still won't speak his name out loud. Not out of respect. Out of something closer to the way you don't say the name of a disease you're afraid of catching. Naomi said nothing. She'd stopped breathing without noticing. My brother's son. He was 4 years old when I first noticed it. The things he did to animals. The way he looked at people when he thought no one was watching him. Taejun's jaw tightened. He was 4, and I could already see it. What happened to them? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. My brother and his son died in an accident 2 years ago. Something about the way he said accident made it clear the word was doing heavy lifting. I was not responsible, but I was not unhappy. He looked at her steadily, making sure she understood what he was telling her. Not the version that was safe to say, but the actual version. I made a decision before I took over the organization. The Beko bloodline ends with me. Whatever is in our blood, whatever has produced 3 generations of men who hurt people for reasons that go beyond survival or necessity, it stops. I made that decision years ago, and I kept it, and it has cost me more inside this organization than you know. He leaned forward slightly. Naomi, your news doesn't break something. It confirms something I already chose. A long pause. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She understood. She understood it completely, and it rearranged everything she'd thought she knew about the last 8 months in about 30 seconds. She should have said something then. She wanted to. But before either of them could say anything more, his phone vibrated. He glanced at it, and the look on his face changed, not dramatically, but in the specific way that a man changes when he's switched from personal to operational, when the part of him that runs an empire has just been activated. There's a meeting, he said. My uncle called it. I have to go. When? Now. He stood. Stay here. Don't go back to your apartment until I call you. There's a car outside. The driver knows to take you somewhere safe if I signal him. She stood too. Taejun, what's happening? He looked at her for a second and she could see him weighing how much to say. My uncle has been patient for a long time, he said. I don't think he's going to stay patient much longer. He left. Naomi sat back down in her chair among the half-packed boxes and the 17 digitized years of someone else's secrets, and she thought about the word good and what it meant and why it had sounded, underneath all its strangeness, like the beginning of something rather than the end. Her hands were trembling slightly. She hadn't noticed until she looked at them. She pressed them flat against her knees and breathed carefully and waited, the way Taejun had waited for her. Like something was coming, and she intended to be standing when it arrived. The driver's name was Park. He hadn't introduced himself. Naomi had seen his name on the laminated card clipped to the sun visor when she finally got into the car 40 minutes after Taejun left. Park. No first name given. He'd been waiting outside the Beko Logistics building in a black sedan with the engine idling, and when she came through the front doors with her coat and her bag and not much else, he'd gotten out immediately and opened the rear door without being asked and without saying a single word. She appreciated that. She was not in a state for words. The car moved through Seoul's late afternoon traffic with the kind of patience that came from someone who drove for a living and had stopped fighting the city a long time ago. Naomi sat in the back and watched the buildings slide past the window and tried to organize her thoughts into something manageable. She couldn't. The word good kept surfacing, not the sound of it. She was past that now, but the weight of what it meant. The thing Tae-jun had told her in that records room was not a small thing. It was the kind of disclosure that people carried alone for decades, the kind that had a specific gravity to it, the kind you didn't offer to someone unless you trusted them with something you couldn't afford to lose. He'd offered it to her in under 10 minutes. Standing in a room surrounded by her packed boxes, while somewhere across the city, his uncle was convening a meeting that Tae-jun had left for immediately, without fully explaining what was at stake. Naomi had spent 8 months being careful. She'd kept her head down and done her job and documented what she found and stayed inside the lines of what she'd been hired to do. She told herself that was professional. She told herself that was smart. Right now, sitting in the back of a car driven by a man whose last name was Park, and who wasn't going to tell her where he was taking her, she wasn't sure she'd been smart so much as she'd been afraid. The car eventually stopped in front of a residential building in a quiet neighborhood she didn't recognize. Wide streets, older apartment blocks, the kind of area that had been middle class once and was now somewhere between gentrified and forgotten. Park got out and opened her door. "You'll be comfortable here," he said. First words he'd spoken. "How long?" "Until Mr. Kong contacts you." "And if he doesn't?" Park held the car door without changing his expression. "He will." The apartment was on the 4th floor. It was clean, spare, and entirely impersonal, the kind of space maintained specifically so that someone could be placed in it at short notice. A kitchen with basic provisions, a bedroom with the tags still on the towels, a window that looked out onto a courtyard where an old man was sitting on a bench feeding pigeons with methodical attention. Naomi put her bag on the kitchen counter and stood in the middle of the main room and breathed. Then she took out her personal laptop, not the work one, which she'd left at Baeko, and opened the secondary drive where she'd been keeping her private documentation log for the past several months. Not the main archive, the one she'd built for herself, parallel to the official project, made up of everything she'd noticed that didn't add up. She'd told herself she kept it for self-protection. If the audit went sideways, if something went wrong and she needed to demonstrate that she'd flagged anomalies, she'd have the record. She told herself that. She scrolled through the log now, looking at it with different eyes. 7 months of careful notations, dates, account numbers, transaction references that didn't correspond to any legitimate shipping activity she could identify. Names that appeared in documentation with no organizational context given. A cluster of transfers all routed through the same 3 shell entities, recurring every 6 to 8 weeks, with minor variations in amount and always just below the threshold that would have triggered automatic compliance flags. She pulled up the entries from months 4 and 5. That was when she'd first noticed the pattern with the offshore accounts. At the time, she'd noted it and moved on, because it wasn't her job to investigate, only to archive. But she'd kept the notes. She looked at one account designation that had shown up 11 times across different document sets, KDS Holdings, 3 letters. She'd filed it away without fully sitting with it, KDS, Kong Do Shik. She sat very still for a moment, then she started pulling every document reference to KDS Holdings and laying them out in sequence. Tech. Tae-jun's phone went to voicemail twice before the meeting even formally started. He knew, walking into the building, a converted office space in Mapogu that Do-shik had used for informal gatherings for years, that his uncle had spent the days before this doing exactly what he himself would have done in the same position, talking to people individually, privately, before the group assembled, shaping the room before anyone walked into it. Tae-jun had not done that. He'd been with Naomi. He registered this as a tactical error and moved on. There was no use in it. The room held 7 men besides himself and Do-shik. 6 of them were senior captains, men who had been with the Baeko syndicate for between 12 and 25 years, men who had earned their positions through combinations of performance and endurance, and in 2 cases, things Tae-jun knew about them that they would prefer he didn't. The 7th was a lawyer named Choi who had represented Baeko interests for over a decade, and whose presence in any internal meeting always meant that whatever was happening was being positioned to look procedural. Tae-jun sat down. He did not look at Do-shik immediately. He poured himself water from the pitcher on the table, and he looked at each of the captains in turn, making sure each one saw that he was not tense. He was not hurrying. He was exactly as much in control of himself as he always was, and the room could read that and decide what to do with it. Doshik remained standing. He was 61, heavy through the shoulders, with the careful grooming of a man who had always wanted to look like more than he was. He and Taejun's father had been close once. Taejun had been told this. He had no memory of it from childhood, only the image of his uncle at the edges of rooms, watching. "We appreciate you coming on short notice," Doshik said. His voice was measured and warm, in the way that interrogation techniques are warm. "You said it was urgent," Taejun said. "It is." Doshik looked at the captains, and the captains looked at the table, and that told Taejun everything he needed to know about how thoroughly his uncle had worked the room before he arrived. "We have a concern that affects the organization's future. I think you know what it is." "Tell me anyway." Doshik reached into the leather folder in front of him and removed a document. He set it on the table and slid it toward the center, not to Taejun specifically, but to the room. "The woman," he said. "Brooks. The American." Taejun's expression did not move. "You've been involved with her for the better part of a year. The organization has noticed. That's not necessarily a problem. You have the right to a personal life." He paused. "But there are aspects of her situation that the organization has a right to know about as well." Captain Ryu, who was seated closest to the document, picked it up without being asked. His eyes moved across the page. Something happened in his face. Not quite discomfort, but the managed version of it. "What is that?" Taejun asked. He knew already, but he needed to hear Doshik say it. "Her medical records," Doshik said, "obtained from the fertility clinic she visited 7 weeks ago." "The woman is infertile, Taejun, completely and permanently. Whatever your feelings for her, she cannot give you an heir. She cannot give this organization what it needs. And the captains have a right to factor that into their assessment of the organization's direction." The room was quiet for exactly long enough to feel orchestrated. Captain Lim, who had been with Bayako since before Taejun's father died, cleared his throat. "Her medical records," he said, to no one in particular. "You obtained her medical records." "Through appropriate means," Doshik said smoothly. "Through a bribed clinic employee," Taejun said, still calm, his voice flat as concrete. "You paid someone to access a private patient's confidential medical file. That's what you mean by appropriate means." Doshik's expression didn't waver. "What I mean is that the organization's future is my appropriate concern. That has always been true, and it hasn't changed." Taejun looked at him across the table. He had a sensation in his chest that he recognized as rage, in the specific form it took when he was controlling it absolutely. Not heat, but cold, a tightening cold, the kind that required something to do with the hands. He pressed both palms flat on the table surface and focused on the physical pressure of it. "You violated a civilian's private medical records," Taejun said. "A woman who has no connection to the organization's operational interests. You went into a private clinic and you paid someone to hand you documents that had nothing to do with Bayako business. And you're presenting this to a room of captains as a legitimate organizational concern. The question of succession is not your question to ask." The silence that followed was different from the first one. This one wasn't orchestrated. It was the silence of 7 men recalibrating. Doshik allowed it to last exactly as long as he'd planned. Then he said quietly and very precisely, "Then whose question is it? Because it's not one you've answered in 4 years of leadership. It's not one you've shown any interest in answering. And the organization—" He paused, letting the words sit. "The organization is beginning to wonder if you intend to answer it at all." Captain Song was the one who spoke next. He was 44, the youngest captain in the room, and under normal circumstances, the one Taejun had assessed as most reliably his. Song had sons of his own, 3 of them, all teenagers, and Taejun had come to his eldest boy's hospital stay 2 years ago without being asked, had sat in that waiting room for 4 hours, had done it because Song was loyal and loyalty should be visible. "I think," Song said carefully, "that what everyone in this room would like to understand is what the plan is. Not about the woman specifically, about continuity. The organization is held together through a lot of difficult transitions because there has always been a clear line of succession. If that line is uncertain, the line is not uncertain," Taejun said. "Then clarify it," Doshik said. The warmth was gone from his voice now, just the blade underneath. "Clarify it for this room. right now, and we can move on from this. Taejun looked at his uncle for a long moment. The man across the table had been patient in the way that people are patient when they believe time is working for them. He'd stayed in the organization through 2 leadership transitions. He'd built his own quiet loyalties over decades. He'd waited until Taejun gave him something to work with. Naomi's medical file was sitting in the center of the table. Taejun thought about the records room, about the word good, about the thing he'd told her, the secret he'd held for 10 years, the decision he'd made and kept and never wavered on despite the cost of it. He thought about the choice he was facing now. He could tell this room the truth. He could explain why the bloodline ended with him, lay out the history, the pattern, the fear that lived in him, that his grandfather's cruelty would find its way through to the next generation. He could say all of it, and they would remove him within the week, or he could say nothing, deflect, buy time, keep the room managing. But Do-shik had prepared for both of those. The man was not foolish. He'd spent 30 years in this organization learning exactly how much rope to give a room before he pulled it taut. Taejun said, "We're done for today." He stood. "We are not done," Do-shik said. "I said we're done." He picked up Naomi's medical file from the center of the table, just reached out and took it, without hurry, folded it once, and put it inside his jacket, and looked at his uncle. "You'll return the original clinic documents to me by end of day tomorrow. Whatever copies exist will also be returned. If they aren't, the discussion we have about your own financial records will be considerably less private than this one." He saw it, just for a second, the flicker in Do-shik's eyes. Not fear. More like adjustment. Like a man who'd expected the game to go one way and was now noting that it might go another. "We're not finished," Do-shik said again, but quieter. "No," Taejun agreed, and he left. He called Naomi from the car. She picked up on the second ring, and the sound of her voice, immediate, no wobble in it, just, "I'm here," did something to him that he didn't have language for and wasn't going to look at directly right now. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine. How was the meeting?" He paused. "He had your medical file." Silence on her end. He could hear her breathing, steady and measured, the sound of someone who had already decided not to panic. "He showed it to the captains," she said. Not a question. "Yes." Another pause, shorter. "And?" "And the room is unsettled, which is what he wanted." He watched the city move outside the car window. "He's been building toward this for longer than I realized. I underestimated his patience." "Do you know how he got the file?" "A paid employee at the clinic. I don't have the name yet." "Okay." Her voice was careful and very even. "I need to tell you something about the archive work." He went still. "Tell me." "I've been keeping a secondary documentation log, my own, separate from the official archive. Things I noticed that didn't fit the standard record patterns." A pause. "I found a set of offshore accounts. They route through 3 shell entities, all below compliance thresholds. They correspond to a holding company designation that shows up 11 times across your logistics records." He said nothing. "KDS Holdings," Naomi said. "I think KDS is Kang Do-shik." The car turned a corner and Taejun pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and breathed once, slowly. "How much is there?" he asked. "I'm still going through it, but what I can see so far—" She stopped, and he could hear the sound of keys, of her working while she talked. "It's substantial, years of it. These aren't small transfers." "Naomi?" "Yes." "How long have you had this?" Another pause. "Longer." "About 4 months. I wasn't sure what to do with it." He understood, without being told, the specific difficulty of her position, a foreign contractor sitting on financial evidence against the uncle of the man she was involved with, inside an organization she hadn't fully understood when she'd signed on, with no clean way out and no one she could hand it to. "You kept it," he said. I kept it." "Why?" He heard her exhale. "Because I didn't know if I could trust anyone with it except you, and for a while I wasn't sure I could trust you." "And now?" She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. "You came back and told me the truth tonight. You didn't have to do that. You could have let me pack and get on a plane and said nothing. That's what most men in your position would have done." "I'm not most men." "No," she said. "You're not." A pause. "The documents are on my personal drive, not on anything connected to Beko's servers. They're clean copies." He said, I'm coming to where Park took you. Don't touch anything on the main Baeko archive system until I get there. I won't. He ended the call. His driver, without being asked, increased speed. He arrived 23 minutes later. Naomi opened the apartment door before he knocked. She'd heard the elevator, and she stood in the doorway with her laptop in one arm and her documentation log open on the screen, and she looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has been thinking very hard and has arrived at a conclusion they're not entirely comfortable with. "Show me," he said. She showed him. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours with the laptop between them while she walked him through everything, methodically, in chronological order, the way she worked, the way she apparently did everything, organized, thorough, without drama. She showed him the original documentation anomalies, the transaction pattern she'd identified, the shell company chain, the KDS Holdings designation appearing across records that spanned 7 years. Tae-jun said almost nothing. He looked at every document she showed him, asked precise questions when he needed clarification, and was silent the rest of the time. She was good. Whatever her firm had hired her to do, what she actually was, what she'd developed over a career of reading other people's financial history, was something considerably sharper than digitization. She'd seen the architecture of Do-shik's theft from inside the records themselves, from the pattern of what was missing and what was wrong, and what had been carefully designed to be overlooked. When she finished walking him through it, the table was covered in printed documentation, and the kitchen was dark except for the laptop's backlight. Neither of them had noticed the time. "He's been taking from the organization for 7 years, Tae-jun said. At minimum. That's only what's in the records I've digitized. If there are earlier boxes, there are. Then it goes back further." He sat back in his chair. His face was very still, and she watched him the way you watch someone who's processing something large, giving them the space of it, not filling the silence. "He waited until he had something on me," Tae-jun said. "Your file. He got your file and he called the meeting immediately, which means he's been building toward this for a while and was waiting for a trigger." He looked at her. "He planned to use your infertility to remove me from leadership. He never planned to let me find out about the financial records." "He didn't know I had them," Naomi said. "Nobody knew about my secondary log." "No." He looked at the table covered in paper. "Nobody knew." The silence between them held something different now. Not the earlier uncertainty, not the careful distance of people managing their feelings under pressure. Something had shifted in the 2 hours they'd spent at that table together. It was hard to name. It felt like the kind of understanding that builds between people who have been through something together, rather than the kind that comes from early relationship courtship, when everything is selective and carefully presented. He'd showed her his worst family secret. She'd showed him 7 years of his uncle's theft. They were sitting in a borrowed apartment at midnight with someone else's towels still in tags in the bedroom and an old man presumably still feeding pigeons somewhere below, and the situation they were both in was genuinely dangerous and neither of them had left. That seemed worth noting, even if not out loud. "There's something else," Naomi said. He waited. "There's a name in the KDS Holdings documentation. It comes up 3 times in transfer records, in connection with payments routed through the smallest of the 3 shell entities. The payments are smaller than the others, and they're structured differently. No business designation, just a personal account reference." She turned the laptop to face him and pointed to a line of text. "The name is Lee Sung-woo. Do you know who that is?" The expression that crossed Tae-jun's face was not one she'd seen before. It lasted only a second, a kind of controlled, cold recognition that told her, without any other information, that she'd found something worse than financial theft. "Lee Sung-woo," he said, and his voice had gone very flat, "was a witness. A civilian witness to an operation 3 years ago that was conducted without my authorization. An operation that resulted in the deaths of 2 people. He stopped. He was supposed to have disappeared, voluntarily, with sufficient incentive to relocate permanently and say nothing. Naomi looked at him. "The payment started 8 months after the operation," she said. "Do-shik was running the operation," Tae-jun said. "I knew it afterward and I couldn't prove it. I knew the witness had been dealt with because the alternative would have brought serious law enforcement attention down on the organization. I assumed—" He stopped again. "You assumed he was paid to disappear," Naomi said quietly. "But he was paid, just not to disappear." He stood up from the table. Doshik has been paying him for 3 years, Taijun said, which means Doshik has had a witness in his back pocket for 3 years, a witness to an unauthorized operation that I am nominally responsible for as the head of this organization. His voice was still flat. I wasn't just building toward a challenge at a captain's meeting. He's been building a case. If I try to move against him, he exposes the operation through the witness. If the witness talks to law enforcement, the entire organization is exposed, Naomi said. Not just the organization. He looked at her across the table. Me, specifically. My name is on the authorization records for that year's operations, even the ones I didn't authorize, because I was the boss. The silence in the kitchen was complete. Naomi looked at the laptop screen and then back at him and said very carefully, "Then we need to move first. If we move first, he surfaces the witness. If he surfaces the witness, we surface all of this." She gestured at the documentation across the table. Every offshore account, every stolen transfer, every shell company, every year of it. He goes down for financial crimes and for the unauthorized operation both, because those payments tie him directly to it. Proving that in a room of captains, not just captains, she said, I have the documentation. I can present it. Everything I built in the secondary log is clean, structured, and documented with source references. It's not law enforcement ready, but for a room of people who understand what they're looking at, she met his eyes. It will be enough. He looked at her. She looked back at him and didn't blink. You'd walk into a room of Beko captains, he said, after what happened today. After Doshik put your medical file on that table in front of all of them. Yes, she said. Why? She considered the question, not performing the consideration, actually sitting with it, which he recognized now as simply how she operated. Because the alternative is letting him win, she said finally. And because you told me the truth tonight when you didn't have to. And because... She stopped for a second and something moved across her face that she let be visible. Because I've been careful my whole career. I've always stayed inside the lines of what I was hired to do and not gone 1 inch further. And I think that's kept me safe. And I think it's also kept me... She paused. Small. In a way I'm tired of. He held her gaze for a long moment. There's one more thing, he said, before we decide anything. He picked up his phone and made a call. 1 ring, answered immediately. Bring the car to the Mapo apartment, he said. We're going to the estate. He put the phone down and looked at Naomi. There's someone I need you to meet, he said. Someone I've been protecting. Someone who changes what this is all about, if you're willing to let it. She didn't ask who. She just closed the laptop, gathered her documentation, and picked up her coat from the chair where she'd put it 3 hours earlier. Her hands were steady. The drive to the estate took 40 minutes through the dark, the city gradually giving way to roads that curved through hillside suburbs and then out into something quieter and more open. And neither of them spoke very much. And the silence between them was the particular kind that exists between people who have already made a decision and are living in the last moments before it becomes irreversible. When they arrived and the car stopped and Taijun led her through the front entrance and down a hallway lit by low, warm light, she heard it before she saw it. A small sound, the kind that only comes from one source in the world, somewhere between a dream and waking. A child's murmur from behind a closed door at the end of the hall. Taijun stopped in front of that door. He looked at her once, checking something, and whatever he saw in her face was what he needed to see, because he knocked softly and pushed the door open, and the room beyond was small and warm, and there was a narrow bed in the corner, and in the bed was a boy, small and dark-haired and barely awake, blinking at the light with the unfocused trust of a child who had not yet decided whether the world was something to be afraid of. Min-ho, Taijun said softly. The boy turned his head and saw Taijun, and something in his face settled, the way a child settles when the person they've anchored to comes into the room. Not excitement, just the quiet unwinding of tension. Then he saw Naomi. He looked at her with the complete unguarded directness that belongs only to very young children and very old people. The look that has no social performance in it, no evaluation, just raw, unmediated curiosity about another person's face. Naomi stood in the doorway of the small, warm room with 7 years of financial documentation pressed under her arm, and she looked at this child who Taijun had been protecting in complete secrecy, and she felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with strategy or documents or the catastrophic meeting waiting for them on the other side of all of this. Minho reached out one small hand toward her, uncertain, offering. And the world, for just that moment, went absolutely still. Naomi took one step into the room. Minho's hand was still extended, not reaching exactly, more like testing the air between them, the way children do when they want something but haven't yet decided whether wanting it is safe. His eyes were very dark and very awake now, despite the late hour, and they moved between Taijun and Naomi with the particular calculation of a child who has learned to read rooms quickly because rooms have not always been kind to him. Naomi crouched down so she wasn't standing over him. It was instinct, not strategy. She set the folder of documentation on the floor beside her and held herself still and let him look. He looked for a long time. Then he said, in a small and careful voice, "Is she staying?" Taejun answered from behind her. "For tonight, yes." Minho considered this. He pulled his hand back slowly, not in rejection, more like he was processing the information and needed his hand back to do it. Then he lay back down against his pillow and pulled the blanket up to his chin and kept watching Naomi with those serious dark eyes. "Okay," he said, and closed his eyes. It took Naomi a moment to stand back up. Her knees didn't want to cooperate, and it had nothing to do with the crouch. She picked up the folder from the floor and straightened and turned and found Taijun watching her from the doorway with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not guarded, not calculating, not the particular composure he maintained in every other context she'd ever seen him in. Just watching. Open in a way that looked like it cost him something. She walked back to the doorway, and he pulled the door nearly closed behind them, leaving it a few inches ajar, and they stood in the hallway together in the low light, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "How long has he been here?" she asked quietly. 14 months. 14 months. She absorbed that. "You've been hiding a 5-year-old child in a private estate for over a year." "Protecting," he said. "There's a difference. His parents died in an operation in Incheon, civilian casualties. The operation was Do Sheik's unauthorized off-book in pursuit of a debt collection that went catastrophically wrong. 2 people died who had no part in anything. Minho was found in the apartment 3 hours later by one of my men who had the sense to call me instead of following standard protocol." He paused. "Standard protocol would have been to handle it quietly." "Handle it," she repeated. "Yes." She looked at the door, at the thin line of warm light along the bottom of it. "He has nobody else?" she asked. "A grandmother in Busan who is 83 and not well. She knows he's safe. She doesn't know where. It was her choice to let me keep him here. She said she couldn't protect him, and she knew it." His voice was very even. "I've been paying for her care." Naomi turned and looked at him. "Taejun, does anyone in the organization know he's here?" "Park. One other person whose discretion I'm certain of." "Not Do Sheik." "No," she breathed. "If Do Sheik finds out, he won't use a child. Even he has limits." She wanted to believe that. She looked at his face and tried to determine whether he believed it himself or whether he was saying it because the alternative was unbearable. She couldn't quite tell. That bothered her. "You asked me if I'd help you become his father," she said. "Yes." "Tonight, in the records room, before you knew any of this was coming to a head." "Yes." She thought about that, about the timing of it, the confession about the bloodline, the question about Minho, and then the phone call from Do Sheik arriving less than 10 minutes later. She thought about how those things lined up. "Were you going to tell me about the meeting?" she asked, "before it happened? Or were you going to let it happen and then tell me after?" He held her gaze. "I didn't know the meeting was coming until an hour before. Do Sheik scheduled it deliberately short notice. But," he stopped. "But I had planned to tell you about Minho before this. I had planned it for the following week, when your contract was ending, when it would have been natural to—" "When I was about to leave," she said. "You were going to tell me when I was about to leave." A pause. "Yes. That's not a coincidence." "No," he said. "It's not." The honesty of it landed without softening. She appreciated that he didn't try to dress it up. He'd been going to use the moment of her departure as the moment of disclosure, because the impending loss would have changed the emotional weight of the information. He knew it, and she knew it, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. That's manipulative, she said. Yes. I need you to know that I know that. I know you know it. She looked at the door again, at the light beneath it. I'm not leaving, she said. Not because of Minho and not because of tonight, because of what you told me in the records room. The thing about your family. She turned back to him. That's the thing I'm staying for. Everything else we can figure out. But I need you to not do that again. Use the timing of things to shape how I feel about them. I need the information when it's real, not when it's convenient. He was quiet for a moment, then, agreed. Okay. She picked up the folder more firmly. Now tell me what happens next. What happened next came faster than either of them had planned. At 6:14 the following morning, Park knocked on the estate door with the particular rhythm that meant urgency, not emergency. A distinction Taejun had apparently established with his people as a code of degrees. Taejun was already awake. Naomi had slept 3 hours on the couch with the documentation folder beside her like a companion animal, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee when Park came in, his face carrying the controlled tension of someone delivering bad news they've already organized into presentable form. Captain Song made contact with Do-shik's people last night, Park said, without preamble. After you left the meeting. Taejun set his coffee down. How certain? Certain. One of our people was present. Song reached out through an intermediary, plausibly deniable, but the content was clear. He's positioning himself toward Do-shik's faction. Naomi watched Taejun absorb this without moving. Song. The captain he'd assessed as most reliably his. The man whose son's hospital room he'd sat in for 4 hours. Who else? Taejun asked. Captain Ryu is unclear. The others are holding, but Park hesitated, which was unusual enough that Naomi noticed it. There's something else. The clinic. The employee who provided your... He glanced at Naomi briefly, correcting course, who provided the Brooks documents to Do-shik. We identified him this morning. And? He's dead, found in his apartment at 5 this morning. Apparent overdose. The kitchen was very quiet. Do-shik is cleaning up, Taejun said. The timing suggests it. Which means he's accelerating. He's not waiting for the next captain's meeting. Taejun stood. He's moving now. Naomi set her coffee down. Naomi, if he moves before we can present the documentation, then it doesn't matter what the documentation shows, Taejun said. If he gets a majority of captains to formally move against my leadership before I can counter, the documentation becomes evidence in a proceeding I'm not controlling. He looked at Park. Where's Lee Sung-woo? Park shook his head. We've been looking since last night. He's not at his registered address. His phone goes straight to voicemail. Do-shik moved him. Most likely. Taejun turned and looked at Naomi. She was already thinking through it. She could feel the architecture of the problem arranging itself in her head the way financial records did when she was mapping a complex structure, layer by layer, looking for the load-bearing points. The captain's meeting, she said. When's the next scheduled one? 4 days, Park said. Do-shik won't wait 4 days, Taejun said. No, she agreed. He'll call an emergency meeting, probably within 24 hours, while Song's defection is still fresh and before you have time to stabilize the other captains. She looked at Taejun. We need to call it first. Both men looked at her. Call the emergency meeting ourselves, she said. Pick the location, control the room setup, set the agenda. Don't give him the chance to frame the proceeding. She picked up the documentation folder. And we present this before he can introduce the witness. The witness we can't find, Park said. The witness whose connection to Do-shik is documented in 7 years of financial records that I have right here, she said. We don't need Lee Sung-woo in the room. We need the paper trail that proves Do-shik has been paying him. The captains can do the math. Taejun was looking at her with an expression that she was beginning to recognize. Not quite surprise, more like the careful attention of someone recalibrating an assessment they thought was already accurate. The location matters, he said. Neutral ground, she said. Somewhere that's neither your territory nor his. Somewhere the captains will read as procedurally legitimate. The harbor facility, Park said. Warehouse B. It's technically Bayeko property, but it's been managed as a shared operational space since your father's time. The captains will accept it as neutral. Taejun nodded once. Call it for tonight. 11 p.m. Every captain, mandatory attendance. Use the standard emergency protocol. Do-shik will know you've moved first. Yes, that's the point. Park left. Taejun turned back to Naomi. She was already opening the folder, already laying documents across the kitchen table in the sequence she intended to present them. Her fingers moving through the papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent her career making complex information comprehensible to rooms that didn't want to understand it. He watched her for a moment. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window at a low angle, and she was frowning slightly at a transaction record, and she had 3 hours of sleep behind her eyes, and she looked nothing like a woman who was about to walk into a room of organized crime leadership to present evidence of internal financial fraud. She looked exactly like herself. That was the thing. Naomi. She didn't look up. I know. I haven't said anything. You're about to tell me this is going to be dangerous, that Doshik will have people in that room, that the captains may not respond the way we're expecting, and that if the room goes against us, there's limited ability to control what happens next. She looked up. I know all of that. I've been sitting here for 6 minutes knowing all of that. Are you going to tell me something I don't know? He was quiet for a second. Minho needs breakfast, he said. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, not quite relief. Something between the two. Go wake him up, she said. I'll be here when you get back. They left for the warehouse facility at 9 that evening, 2 hours ahead of the meeting. Taejun's reasoning was practical. He wanted to be in the space before anyone else arrived, to position himself correctly, to understand the room's geometry before it filled with people who had been working on their own positioning for days. Naomi had spent the afternoon organizing and printing documentation in clean, structured packets, 12 copies, one for each captain, assembled in the order she intended to walk through them. She'd done it at the estate's study desk, while Minho sat on the floor nearby with building blocks, occasionally holding one up toward her for comment. And she'd commented on each one with the particular divided attention of someone running 2 tracks simultaneously and managing both adequately. She'd also made a decision she hadn't told Taejun about yet. The warehouse was large and cold and smelled of seawater and rust, and the particular industrial staleness of a space that saw activity in bursts rather than continuously. The harbor was visible through high, narrow windows, dark water, container lights, the distant sound of a crane operating somewhere further along the dock. Taejun walked the space twice. Naomi watched him assess it, where the entrances were, where the light was, where a man who wanted to control a room would stand versus where a man who wanted to observe one would position himself. She filed this away, not because she was analyzing him, but because understanding how he thought was now operationally relevant. The captains arrived between 10:40 and 11. They came in ones and twos, each reading the room immediately upon entry, each making the same set of micro-assessments, who was already there, where they were standing, what the energy was. Naomi had seen this kind of room behavior before in corporate contexts, the same animal calculation underneath the suits, the same quick reading of alliance and exposure. Doshik arrived at 5 minutes to 11 with 2 men she hadn't seen before. Not captains, not Park's equivalent, larger, positioned differently. She noticed where they placed themselves in relation to the room's exits and felt something cold move through her stomach that she breathed past without letting it reach her face. Doshik looked at her across the warehouse floor and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has decided the outcome and is watching the other party take their position, still unaware. Taejun moved to the center of the room and the captains arranged themselves in a rough semicircle, habit and hierarchy, determining their positions without anyone directing it. Thank you for coming, Taejun said. His voice was level and carried without effort. I'll keep the framing brief. There are matters affecting this organization that need to be addressed in full and in the open. We'll start with the financial records. He nodded at Naomi. She distributed the documentation packets. She moved around the room efficiently, placing one in front of each captain, keeping her eyes on the papers rather than the faces, keeping her breathing steady. When she placed Doshik's packet in front of him, she did not look at him. She felt him watching her. She moved on. She returned to her position beside Taejun and opened her own copy and began. What you have in front of you is a 7-year record of financial transfers routed through 3 shell entities, Daisong Trading, Mirai International Holdings, and Pacific Rim Consulting, all of which are subsidiaries of a parent holding company designated as KDS Holdings. She spoke clearly without rushing. These transfers originate in Bioco Logistics operational accounts and are routed outside the organization's standard financial structure below compliance trigger thresholds, on a recurring cycle averaging every 6 to 8 weeks. The room was very quiet. Captains were looking at the documents in front of them. KDS Holdings, she continued, corresponds to... This is theater, Doshik said. She stopped, looked up. I was leaning back in his chair with the packet closed in front of him, his arms crossed, and the smile was still there, but harder now, more precisely deployed. This is a foreign contractor with a personal grievance presenting documents she herself compiled from an archive she had sole access to, with no independent verification. This is not evidence. This is a performance. The source documents are all cataloged with their original BICO archive reference numbers, Naomi said. Every item in that packet can be cross-referenced against the original paper records in the archive room at BICO Logistics. The trail is verifiable by anyone in this room who wants to verify it. What I want, Doshik said, is to understand why the boss has brought a civilian contractor into a closed organizational meeting to present materials of disputed origin against a senior member of this family. He looked at the captains. Because that's what's actually happening here. That's the conversation we should be having, Captain Ryu said carefully. The account designations are consistent with what I can see in our own quarterly reports. Doshik turned his head toward Ryu, just his head, slowly. Ryu went quiet. And that was when Naomi understood, with the particular cold clarity of a problem snapping into focus, that Doshik hadn't just turned Song. He'd gotten to Ryu as well, and possibly one or two others she couldn't identify yet from body language alone. He'd worked the room more thoroughly than they'd accounted for. She kept her face still and calculated quickly. They had the documentation. The documentation was solid. But documentation required a room willing to read it in good faith, and Doshik had spent days ensuring that this room was not uniformly willing to do that. He'd seeded doubt about the source. He'd positioned Naomi specifically as a compromised presenter, a civilian with a grievance, a woman whose presence in this meeting was itself the irregularity. She felt Taejun shift slightly beside her, not retreat, the opposite. The particular settling of a person who has absorbed a reversal and is reorienting without flinching. Let's talk about Lee Sung-woo, Taejun said. Doshik's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes moved. Page 14, Naomi said to the room. Payment records, third shell entity, personal account reference. The name on the account is Lee Sung-woo. The payments are recurring, beginning 8 months after an operation in Incheon that resulted in 2 civilian fatalities. She let that sit. Mr. Lee was a witness to that operation. He was understood to have been compensated for his silence and relocated. She looked at Doshik. The relocation appears not to have happened. The compensation, however, has been ongoing. For 3 years. The quality of the silence changed. Captain Lim, the oldest captain in the room, who had said almost nothing at either meeting, turned to page 14. He looked at it for a long time. He turned back to the front page and looked at the KDS Holdings designation. He turned to page 14 again. Doshik, Lim said. Not a question, just the name, said in a tone that had decades of this organization in it. Doshik uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. His composure was still in place, but it required effort now. Naomi could see the effort, the faint tightening at the jaw, the deliberate way he placed his hands on the table. What you're seeing is a deliberate fabrication by a woman who has had access to this organization's records for months and has used that access to manufacture a case against me because the original records are in the archive, Naomi said. Boxes 1 through 47, physically present in the Bioco Logistics building. Any captain who wants to send their own people to pull the source documents and verify these references can do so tonight. Tonight, Doshik repeated. And now the smile was gone. Just his face, stripped of it, and the face underneath was harder and older and something else. Something that Naomi recognized as the expression of a man transitioning from strategy to contingency. You want to verify the title of an emergency meeting you called less than 12 hours ago, with a presentation prepared by a woman who has been sleeping with the boss for 8 months. He looked at the captains. Is there anyone in this room who doesn't see what this is? Song said, from the far end of the semicircle. I have questions about the authorization chain. Taejun looked at him. Then ask them. Song held his gaze for a second, and in that second Naomi could see the thing that happened in it, the small, terrible thing, which was that Song couldn't quite hold it. He looked down first. The Incheon operation, he said. If the fatalities were unauthorized, if that operation happened without your knowledge, then there's a chain of command question that doesn't get resolved by the financial records. Because the boss is still nominally responsible for operations conducted in his name. That's correct, Tae-jun said. And that's exactly why those records matter, because they establish who actually authorized and financially benefited from that operation. Or, Do-shik said very quietly, they establish that the boss knew about the operation, knew about the witness, and has spent the past 3 years arranging the documentation to point elsewhere. The room received this. Naomi's chest tightened. She watched the captains' faces, the way the suggestion settled into them, not replacing certainty but creating doubt. And doubt was what Do-shik needed. Not conviction, not proof of anything, just enough doubt to justify the next step. She hadn't prepared for this version. She'd prepared for the documentation to carry weight, for the financial evidence to be legible and convincing. She hadn't prepared for Do-shik to turn the whole frame of the meeting, to position not just her materials, but the meeting itself as Tae-jun's fabrication, his preemptive move to deflect from his own culpability. She glanced at Tae-jun. His face was still. His hands were at his sides. I was looking at Do-shik with an expression she didn't have a name for. Something beyond anger, something colder and more resolved. The expression of a man who has just watched the last possible exit close. Bring him in, Do-shik said to one of the 2 large men by the door. Naomi's stomach dropped. The man went out through the side entrance. 20 seconds later, he came back with a third person. A man in his 40s, thin-shouldered, wearing civilian clothes that looked like he'd put them on in a hurry, his eyes moving rapidly around the room in the way of someone who is deeply frightened and trying to hide it, and failing. Lee Sung-woo. Naomi heard her own breathing. She kept it measured. Do-shik hadn't just moved the witness. He'd brought him here. To this meeting. Tonight. Which meant he'd known Tae-jun would call an emergency meeting, had anticipated it, and had prepared the counter in advance. He'd been 3 moves ahead. The whole time. Mr. Lee, Do-shik said, with the warmth back in his voice now, the warmth fully deployed, please tell this room what you told me. About the Incheon operation. About who gave the order. Lee Sung-woo looked at Tae-jun. There was something in his look that was complicated. Not pure calculation, but calculation mixed with something that might have been genuine fear, the kind that compelled rather than chose. The order came from the top, he said. His voice was thin. I heard the call, I heard the name. It wasn't... He stopped, swallowed. His eyes went briefly to Do-shik and then back to Tae-jun. It was Kong. Kong gave the order. Which Kong? Captain Lim said from his seat in a very even voice. Lee Sung-woo's mouth opened and then closed. And in the 3 seconds of silence that followed, Naomi understood what Lee Sung-woo actually was. Not a convinced witness, not a man who had been paid to tell a prepared story, but a man who was genuinely terrified and who had said what he'd said because he didn't know what the safe answer was, because both men in this room had power over him, and he was trying to read which one had more. Which Kong? Lim said again. Lee's voice broke slightly. I'm not... He heard the name on a phone call, Do-shik said smoothly, starting to speak over the hesitation. He can describe the voice, He doesn't know, Tae-jun said. The room went quiet. He doesn't know which of us he heard, Tae-jun said. He looked at Lee Sung-woo directly, not with threat, with something closer to recognition. You were in the building during the call. You heard a voice. You heard the name Kang. You assumed it was the boss. He paused. My uncle's name is also Kang. Lee Sung-woo's face crumpled slightly. Not crying. The near cry of someone who has been under enormous pressure for 3 years and has just had the trap they're in named precisely. Lee started. That's enough, Do-shik said sharply, and the sharpness was a mistake. It rang in the room. Several of the captains registered it. The way a careful man loses control of his careful voice when something doesn't go the way it was scripted. Captain Lim set his documentation packet down on the table in front of him, slowly, deliberately, and said to the room at large, I'd like the archive records independently verified before this proceeding goes any further. There's no time for... Do-shik began. I'm not asking for your timeline, Do-shik. Lim's voice was quiet and absolute. I'm 61 years old, and I've been in this organization since before you had gray hair, and I am telling this room that I want independent verification of the archive records before we take any action. That is my position. Doshik looked at Lim for a moment, then at the room, then at Taejun, and Naomi watched him make the calculation, watched it happen in his face in real time, the assessment of where the room was, whether he had enough, whether he could override Lim's seniority in this moment, or whether trying to do so would cost him more than waiting. He decided to wait. Fine, he said. We'll recess, pending verification. It should have felt like breathing room. Naomi told herself it was breathing room, but she watched Lee Sung-woo being guided back toward the side exit by Doshik's two men, and she watched the way Song still wouldn't look at Taejun, and she watched the careful neutrality on Ryu's face, and she understood that a recess was not a victory. It was a pause inside which Doshik was going to do something they hadn't anticipated. She was right. 40 minutes later, Park's phone rang. He was standing 20 feet away near the warehouse's east wall, and Naomi watched his face as he listened to whatever was being said on the other end, and she watched the color change in it. Not dramatically, but in the specific way of someone receiving information that restructures everything they thought they knew about the shape of the problem. Park ended the call and walked to Taejun. He leaned in close and spoke quietly. Taejun went very still. Naomi moved to his side. What? Taejun looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him in all the months she'd known him. Not fear, not anger, not the controlled cold she'd seen in the meeting room. Something rawer. Something that looked like a man who has just discovered that the thing he was most protecting has been exposed. The estate, he said. Her blood went cold. Someone told Doshik's people about the estate, Taejun said. They're already there. Minho. The child who had reached out his small hand in the warm light of a bedroom, who had said, okay, and closed his eyes, who had held up building blocks for her comment all afternoon, who was 5 years old and alone in a house that was no longer safe. The word came out of Naomi before she could consider it, before she could route it through any version of composure or calculation. Go. She was already moving toward the door when she said it, and Taejun was already beside her, and the warehouse fell away behind them into cold air and the sound of harbor water, and the night was very dark, and the car was there, and they were in it before the captains inside even registered that the principals had left the room. The drive that had taken 40 minutes that morning took 22 minutes now, because Park drove the way men drive when the stakes have changed, when speed is no longer about efficiency, but about something that can't be measured in minutes. Naomi sat in the back seat, with her hands pressed flat on her knees, the same gesture she'd used in the records room that first day. The gesture that meant she was holding herself together by deliberate physical pressure, and looked out the window at the dark city moving past, and thought about a 5-year-old boy, asleep in a warm room, with the door left a few inches ajar so the hall light could reach him. She thought about what Doshik's men would do when they found him there. She thought about what kind of person uses a child as leverage. And then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it was not useful, and being useful was the only thing she had left to be right now. How many? Taejun said to Park. 2 vehicles. 4 men, possibly more. Armed? Assumed. Is there anyone at the estate? 1 man, young, he won't... Park stopped. He won't be enough, Taejun said. Not bitter, just accurate, Naomi said, without looking away from the window. Does Minho know the house? The layout? Are there places he knows to hide? A pause. We've talked about it, Taejun said. There's a room in the back, below the main floor, a storage space. He knows to go there if he's frightened, if something doesn't feel right. Does he know what not right feels like? Another pause, longer. He's a child who lost both his parents to violence, Taejun said quietly. He knows what not right feels like. Naomi closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them. Then he may already be hiding, she said. He may already have done exactly what he needed to do. She said it because it might be true. She said it because the alternative, that a 5-year-old boy was alone and frightened in a house with men who would use him as a tool, was a thought that would take her apart if she let it, and she could not afford to be taken apart right now. Not yet. The car turned off the main road and onto the narrower approach to the estate, and the headlights swept across the iron gate at the entrance, and Naomi saw the vehicles, two black SUVs parked with deliberate casualness at angles that blocked the gate. And in the wash of headlights, she saw the figures standing beside them, and the figures saw the car, and everything that happened next happened very fast. Park killed the headlights before they reached the gate. The car rolled to a stop 30 meters back, engine dropping to idle, and for one compressed second, the four of them, Taejun, Naomi, Park, and the second man Taejun had brought from the warehouse, sat in the sudden dark and looked at the two black SUVs blocking the entrance. Four figures visible, maybe more inside the vehicles or already past the gate. Taejun had his phone out. He dialed once. 3 rings, no answer. He dialed again. Same. The man he'd left at the estate was either already down or had gone silent to avoid giving himself away, and neither option was reassuring. Back entrance, Taejun said to Park. 3 minutes on foot through the east tree line. Go. Park and the second man got out of the car without sound, the kind of practiced quiet that came from doing this before. The careful handling of the door latch, the weight-shifted exit that didn't rock the vehicle. They moved into the dark at the road's edge and were gone. Taejun turned to Naomi. She was already looking at him. Stay in the car, he said. No. Naomi, Minho knows my face, she said. He doesn't know Park's. If they find him and he's frightened, he needs to see someone he recognizes. She held Taejun's eyes. You know I'm right. He looked at her for 2 seconds. The muscle in his jaw moved once. Stay behind me, he said. Every step. You don't move unless I move. Agreed. He reached under the seat and came up with a handgun that he checked by feel in the dark. The practiced motion of someone who has done this without light enough times that his hands knew the geometry without instruction. He chambered around and put the safety on and put it at the back of his waistband. And then he looked at Naomi one more time with an expression that said everything he wasn't going to say out loud, and then he was out of the car and moving, and she was right behind him. The cold hit immediately. Night air off the hills, the kind that carried moisture in it, that settled against the face and the back of the hands. Naomi's breath came out visible in the ambient light from the distant gate lamps, and she pulled it back deliberately, breathing smaller, quieter, following Taejun along the road shoulder toward the tree line to the east. She was wearing the same clothes she'd put on at the apartment the previous evening. Flat shoes, which was fortunate. She moved as quietly as she could through the dead leaves at the tree line's edge, matching Taejun's pace, keeping exactly the distance he'd told her, close enough to touch his back if she reached out. He stopped once, held up a fist, and she stopped immediately. They both stood still for 5 seconds, listening. Wind in branches. The distant idle of one of the SUVs, someone had left an engine running, the creak of the gate already open. They'd already gone through. Taejun moved again, faster now. The estate's east wall was rough stone, older than the main building, and there was a section near the corner where the drainage channel ran under it, a gap barely large enough for a person to move through sideways, ground level, hidden by overgrown grass that the gardener had apparently decided wasn't worth the effort. Taejun knew exactly where it was. He went straight to it, went through first, and reached back for her hand as she followed, and the contact was brief and necessary, and neither of them made anything of it. Inside the wall, the estate grounds opened up. Formal garden to the left, service path to the right, the main house 20 meters ahead with light in 3 of its windows. Movement in the second window from the left. A figure passing. Inside the house. Taejun pressed himself against the wall and Naomi did the same, her shoulder blades against cold stone, and she counted the windows and calculated which room the second from the left was. The kitchen. Which meant they'd come in through the back, not the front. Which meant they'd bypassed whatever was left of the front security entirely. 1 man down, then. At minimum. She thought about the young man Park had mentioned. Young. She didn't know his name. She hoped he was unconscious and not worse, and she filed that thought away and focused on the house. Taejun tapped her arm twice. She looked at him. He held up 2 fingers, pointed toward the service path, then held up 1 finger and pointed toward the main entrance. 3 men accounted for inside, possibly more. I didn't know, and she didn't know, and the thing they needed to do was get inside without being heard and find Minho before anyone with a reason to use him figured out where he was. The storage room, below the main floor. She touched Taejun's arm and leaned in close to his ear. The storage room. How do you access it from outside? He turned his head and his mouth was near her ear. Cellar door, east side of the house, stone steps. That's where Minho will go, she breathed. Show me. He looked at her for a second, assessing, checking, and then nodded and moved along the wall toward the east side of the house. They reached the cellar door without meeting anyone. It was low and wooden and set into the ground at an angle, the kind that folded open in two halves, and when Tae-jun tried it, it lifted an inch and stopped, latched from inside. Naomi felt her heart seize and then restart, because a latched door meant someone inside had latched it, Minho. Tae-jun crouched and knocked. 4 quiet knocks. A pause. 2 more. A pattern. And after 4 seconds of silence that felt much longer, there was a small sound from inside. A scrape of something being moved, a latch being worked by small hands. And the door opened, and the faint light from the cellar's single overhead bulb outlined the shape of a 5-year-old boy standing at the top of the stone steps, with both hands gripping the door edge, and his face wide open with relief so intense it looked like pain. He didn't make a sound. He'd been trained not to make a sound when he hid, and whatever fear was in him, he'd held that instruction. Tae-jun went down the steps and had the boy in his arms before Naomi could process the motion, and she went in behind them and pulled the cellar door closed and worked the latch back into place, and stood in the low-ceilinged stone room smelling of damp concrete and motor oil, and listened to Tae-jun speak in Korean. Very quiet, very steady, the voice you use with a frightened child that has nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with what they need to hear. And watched Minho's hands grip the back of Tae-jun's shirt with both fists and not let go. She pressed her back against the wall beside the door and breathed. After a moment, she heard footsteps. Above them. Someone walking across the kitchen floor. One set of footsteps, moving with the casual weight of a person who is searching methodically and is not particularly rushed, which was somehow worse than urgency. It meant they felt secure. It meant they didn't think anyone was going to interrupt them. Minho heard it too. His grip on Tae-jun's shirt tightened. He didn't look up. Tae-jun held him with one arm and with his other hand had the gun out, safety off, muzzle pointed at the cellar ceiling. Naomi looked at the cellar door above them, at the latch, at how much force it would take to pull it open from outside if someone found it and decided to try. Not much. She looked around the cellar. Shelving units along 3 walls, mostly empty. A metal storage cabinet in the far corner, chest height. A workbench with tools arranged on a pegboard above it. She moved to the workbench, slowly, avoiding sound. She found what she was looking for without turning on any additional light. A length of steel pipe, the kind used for shelving assembly, about 60 centimeters long. She carried it back to the cellar door and threaded it through the latch mechanism, bracing both ends against the door frame's inner edges. It wouldn't hold forever. It would hold long enough to matter. Tae-jun watched her do this and said nothing. His eyes said something, but there was no time for it. He set Minho down carefully and crouched to eye level with the boy. She couldn't hear what he said in Korean. It was barely sound, the lowest possible voice. But she saw Minho nod, twice, very serious, the nod of a child who has been told something important and is committing to it. Then Tae-jun looked at Naomi. I have to clear the house, he said. I know. You stay here with him. I know. The pipe won't. I know that too. She met his eyes. Go. He went up the stone steps and opened the cellar door a controlled 8 inches and slipped out into the night without a sound, and the door settled back behind him. Naomi descended the steps and sat on the bottom one and looked at Minho, who was standing in the middle of the cellar floor watching her with those serious dark eyes. She patted the step beside her. He came and sat. Not touching her yet, close. She breathed. She listened to the footsteps above. 2 sets now, moving in different directions. They'd spread out. She put her arm very slowly around Minho's shoulders and felt him not flinch, and thought about what that said about the months he'd spent in this house, about the care that had been taken with a child who had been handed to them by catastrophe, about what a person's instincts for safety felt like when they'd been tended instead of broken. He leaned into her side. She held him, and listened, and waited. Park had taken the back entrance on a 6-minute delay from when Tae-jun and Naomi went through the east wall, and when he came through the service entrance of the estate's utility building, he found 2 things. The young guard who'd been left at the estate, a man named Huang, 24 years old, who had been with Baiko for just under 2 years, sitting zip-tied to a support beam with a split lip and a look of furious humiliation, and one of Doshik's men standing with his back to the utility building's side door. Park's companion moved first. Fast and close, the kind of combat that doesn't have the room for ceremony, and the man went down without making significant noise, and the situation resolved in approximately 12 seconds. They cut Huang loose. He stood up immediately, which Park took as a good sign regarding his structural integrity. "How many?" Park said. "4 came in," Huang said, touching his lip with the back of his hand. "Maybe a 5th in the vehicles." "The child?" "I don't know. I was down before I could—" He stopped. "I heard them asking about the boy. They knew about him." Park's phone vibrated. Taijun. One word in the text. Inside. Park went. Taijun came through the main house's rear utility entrance and entered the kitchen and was inside for 4 seconds before the man at the kitchen counter turned around. And the 4 seconds mattered because they gave Taijun the geometry of the room. Where the man was, where the second man he could hear in the adjacent hallway was, where the furniture was, and where it wasn't. The man at the counter was large and had a weapon in his hand, and the weapon started to come up, and Taijun crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and the next 7 seconds were very physical and very specific, and extremely loud compared to what had come before. The counter edge hitting someone's back, the particular sound of a head making contact with a cabinet door, a gun skittering across tile to stop against the baseboard. Then quiet. Taijun was breathing hard. His left shoulder had taken an impact from the counter edge and would be a problem later. Right now it was just information. The man from the hallway appeared in the kitchen doorway, and the situation in the kitchen told him everything. In the half-second it took for his brain to process the visual, and by then Taijun already had his own gun up. "On the floor," Taijun said. The man looked at his colleague and at the gun and made the calculation that people make when the math is clear, and he went to his knees and then to the floor with his hands visible. "How many of you are in the house?" Taijun said. "2, just us." "Where are the others?" "Outside, at the gate." A pause. "And 1 more upstairs." 3 inside total. The man on the floor, the man now unconscious against the cabinet, and 1 more upstairs who hadn't heard the kitchen because the house's construction was old and the walls were thick. Taijun zip-tied the conscious man to the kitchen's support column. He kept ties in his jacket, had for years. One of those small preparatory habits that most people who lived his life eventually developed, and moved to the stairs. The upstairs man heard him on the 3rd step. Taijun heard the footstep adjustment above, the shift from the casual walk of a searching man to the careful weight of someone who'd registered something wrong. He stopped. They both held position for 3 seconds, Taijun on the 3rd step, and the man above at the top of the stairs. And the silence was the particular silence of 2 people determining whether to commit. The man above committed first, and it was a mistake because he came fast and down the stairs meant he was coming to Taijun's ground, not the other way, and that was worse for him than staying up. Taijun stepped back off the stairs and let the man's momentum carry him to the landing, and then it was close and brutal, and the shoulder screamed when it took the impact, and he worked through it. When Park came through the back door 2 minutes later, Taijun was standing in the kitchen with 3 of Doshik's men secured, his left shoulder making itself loudly known, and sweat cutting through the dust on his face. Park took 1 look at him. "The cellar?" "They're safe," Taijun said. "Go signal the gate men away. Tell them the boss is in the house, and if they're still on this property in 5 minutes, he'll take it as a formal declaration." "Will they leave?" "They're hired security, not soldiers. Doshik's real assets are at the warehouse." He picked up one of the secured men's phones. "They'll leave." Naomi heard Taijun's knock on the cellar door, the same 4-2 pattern, and removed the steel pipe from the latch and pushed the door up and climbed out into the cold night air with Minho's hand held very firmly in hers. Taijun was standing in the estate's east yard with leaves on his jacket and blood along his left jawline from a cut she couldn't immediately place, and his shoulder held slightly wrong, and when he saw them, his entire body changed, not visibly to anyone who didn't know what to look for, but she saw it. The held breath released, the body's accounting of itself completing. Minho looked at the blood on Taijun's jaw with wide eyes. You're hurt, the boy said. A little, Taijun said. Minho considered this with great seriousness. Then he reached up and touched the edge of the cut very carefully with 2 fingers, so gently it was barely contact at all, the way children touch things that frighten them when they've decided the fear is smaller than the caring. Taijun went very still. Naomi looked away for a second, at the dark tree line and the cold sky, because some moments aren't meant to be witnessed fully. They're meant to happen in the partial privacy of other people's averted eyes. Then Taijun said quietly, "We can't stay here," and the moment folded back into the situation, and they moved. They went back to the warehouse. It was the last place that made sense, and the only place that was necessary. Doshik was still there. Taijun confirmed it through a call to Captain Lim, who answered on the first ring, which told Taijun that Lim had been waiting for the call, which told him other things as well. "The recess is still in effect," Lim said. "He's waiting. He knows you left." "Does he know why?" A pause. "He made a call about 10 minutes after you went. I don't know what was said." "Is he expecting me back?" "He's expecting something." Another pause, longer. "Taijun, whatever you're going to do, come back and do it in front of the room. Don't handle this outside the meeting. If you handle it outside, it becomes something else." "I know. I'm telling you because I want you to hear it from someone who doesn't want the alternative." Taijun looked at Naomi across the car. She was in the back seat with Minho asleep against her side, his head on her arm, her hand at the back of his hair, his breathing the deep unconscious rhythm of a child who has been frightened and is now safe, and his body knows the difference. She was looking at Taijun. She had the documentation folder in her other hand. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, Taijun said, and ended the call. He looked at Park in the front seat. "The estate isn't safe. We need someone with them." "I'll stay," Huang said, from the front passenger seat. His lip had stopped bleeding. His expression indicated he had strong personal reasons to want to be useful right now and was grateful for the opportunity. Taijun nodded. "If anyone comes before I call you, anyone, you leave through the east wall and you don't stop." "Understood." Taijun turned back to Naomi. She was looking at him with the clear-eyed, unflinching attention she'd given him in the kitchen at the borrowed apartment, in the records room, in every moment of this that had asked something of her, which was apparently all of them. "You don't have to go back," he said. "You can stay with him." She looked at the boy asleep against her. She looked at Taejun. She looked at the documentation folder. "If I stay here," she said, "who presents the evidence?" He didn't answer. "You're the boss," she said. "You can't also be the person holding the documents. The captains need to see those 2 things as separate, your authority and the evidence. They need to see the evidence come from someone who has no leadership stake in the outcome." She shifted very carefully so that Minho's head moved from her arm to the seat cushion, and she pulled her arm free with the practiced gentleness of someone who has done this before, though she hadn't, not exactly, not with this specific child. But the body knows some things without instruction. "I'm the one who found it. I'm the one who built the log. I'm the one who has to present it. Doshik will come at you again. Let him." She straightened and pressed her free hand briefly to Minho's hair once, and then she met Taejun's eyes. "I'm ready for it this time." The drive to the warehouse took 28 minutes. Naomi spent them with the documentation folder open on her lap, reviewing her sequence in the low light, running through the structure of what she intended to say, the order of the documents, the points at which she expected interruption, and what she would say when it came. She was aware that her hands had been unsteady an hour ago. She was aware that the cellar and the footsteps and the steel pipe and Minho's weight against her side had taken something from her that she'd need to account for afterward when this was over and there was space to be human about it. Right now, there was not that space. She closed the folder and held it on her lap and breathed. They walked into the warehouse at 12:47 in the morning. The captains were all still present. She noted that first, the fact that no one had left, that even Song and Ryu were in their chairs, and she parsed what that meant. It meant the room didn't know which way this was going. It meant they were waiting to see, which was still possible, which was still something to work with. Doshik was standing. He'd been standing for a while, she thought. There was the faintest quality of someone maintaining a position against the natural desire to sit, the kind of deliberate physical statement that got heavier as the hours went on. He looked at Taejun, then at Naomi, then at the fact that they'd come back at all, and something moved through his face that she catalogued very carefully. He hadn't expected them back. He'd expected the estate to produce a different result. He'd sent 4 men, and he'd expected a different result, and they were standing in front of him, and that meant something had gone wrong at the estate, and he didn't know what yet. That was information. She filed it. "The recess is over," Taejun said to the room. Not loudly. He didn't need loud. "We're resuming." "Where did you go?" Song asked. The question was aggressive in the way that defensive questions are aggressive. "My property was accessed without authorization by men connected to this man." Taejun pointed at Do-shik once, briefly, the way you point at something that doesn't require extended identification. "That's been handled. We're resuming." "Accessed how?" Captain Zhang asked. Zhang was one of the captains who'd held neutral all night, who'd said almost nothing in either meeting. His question had the quality of someone who is genuinely trying to understand the facts, not shape them. 4 men with weapons entered the estate grounds. They were looking for a child I've been protecting, an orphan, the son of 2 people killed in the Incheon operation that this room has been discussing. Taejun's voice did not waver. "The child is 5 years old. He is currently safe." The room absorbed this. Captain Lim looked at Do-shik. Slowly, the way old men look at things they've made up their minds about. "Is that true?" Lim asked. Do-shik spread his hands in a gesture of measured reasonableness. "I sent people to the estate to secure it. Given the instability of tonight's, you sent armed men to a location with a child in it," Lim said. "To secure it. To secure it. Yes." In the middle of an organizational meeting that the boss was present for. Lim's voice was very even, without his knowledge or authorization. Do-shik's carefully measured reasonableness showed its edges. The situation required, "I'd like to hear from Ms. Brooks," Zhang said. The room shifted. Do-shik's eyes moved to Zhang with the specific attention of a man noting a defection. Naomi set the documentation folder on the table and opened it. She did not wait for anyone to tell her to proceed. "Page 14, she said. "We established before the recess that the KDS Holdings account designations appear 11 times across the Beko Logistics archive. I want to direct your attention now to something we hadn't fully covered, the structural relationship between the 3 shell entities." She looked up briefly. Daesong Trading, Mirai International Holdings, and Pacific Rim Consulting are not parallel entities. They're sequential. Money moves from Baeko operational accounts into Daesong first, then transfers to Mirai, then to Pacific Rim, then to KDS Holdings. Each transfer is below threshold. Each entity has a separate corporate registration in a separate jurisdiction. She paused. "This is not amateur accounting. This is a deliberate multi-stage laundering structure that someone spent time designing." "As we noted," Do-shik said, "the provenance of these documents—" "Let her finish," Lim said. Do-shik's jaw tightened. He let her finish. "The transfers to Lee Sung-woo run parallel to this structure, but separately," she continued. "They're smaller and they originate directly from Pacific Rim Consulting, the final stage entity, rather than from KDS Holdings itself. Which is worth noting because it means the Lee Sung-woo payments weren't processed through the same architecture as the main transfers. They were handled differently, more carefully." She met several pairs of eyes around the room, one by one. "The only reason to handle a payment more carefully than your already careful payment structure is because you understand it to be more dangerous. The financial transfers are fraud. The payments to Lee Sung-woo are something closer to obstruction, and whoever set this up knew the difference." The room was very quiet. Do-shik stood up fully, pushing back from his chair, and the movement had a quality she recognized. Not the controlled movement of a man managing the room, but the instinctive movement of a cornered person needing space, needing to change the physical geometry because the existing geometry had become intolerable. "Lee Sung-woo's testimony establishes," he started. "Lee Sung-woo's testimony established nothing," Taejun said, from his position at the room's center. "He heard the name Kong on a phone call. He doesn't know which Kong. He said so." He looked at the captains. "My uncle has been paying a witness $3,000 a month for 3 years to keep him available and afraid. That's what the payments are. Not silence money for the witness to disappear, maintenance money to keep him in place and dependent, ready to be produced when needed." He paused. Tonight, he was produced. "That is a..." Doshik started. He hesitated, Captain Song said. Everyone looked at Song. Song was looking at the table. He said it again, quieter but clearer. The witness hesitated. When Lim asked him which Kang, he didn't answer. He looked at Doshik first. Song's voice was strange, the voice of a man saying something he hadn't decided to say until he said it. I saw it. We all saw it. Doshik looked at Song with an expression that would have been at home on a man watching a bridge he'd built fall into a river. You're going to want to think carefully, Doshik said to Song, very quietly. I've been thinking carefully, Song said, all night. Thinking carefully about a boy's hospital room and who sat in the waiting room for 4 hours without being asked. He finally looked up at Tae-jun. I made a mistake. I made it because he got to me before the meeting, and I let the fear of the succession question override what I actually know about this organization and who's run it. He paused. I'm telling you now, for whatever that's worth. It's worth something, Tae-jun said. His voice was even. Not gracious, not warming, just accurate. Doshik turned away from Song with the deliberate movement of someone removing a variable from their calculations permanently, and he looked at Naomi, and the look was not the calculating appraisal of before or the deployed warmth of the meeting. It was something stripped down and direct and genuinely cold. You came here with paper, he said. You stood in a room of men who have survived things you cannot imagine, and you waved paper at them, and you think that's enough. You think a spreadsheet ends this. No, she said. She met his eyes without looking away. I think the spreadsheet ends you. This, she put her hand flat on the documentation folder, goes to every captain in this organization, and to Baeko's legal counsel, and to the financial compliance records for the regulatory audit that your own logistics company has scheduled for next quarter. The archive is already digitized. I did that job. Every document I've referenced tonight has an archive reference number and a digital timestamp and a physical original. She kept her eyes on him. You didn't know I was keeping a secondary log. You knew I had access to the archive, but you didn't know I was building a parallel record. That was your mistake. Doshik looked at her. You made a mistake too, he said. You're still in this room. It happened fast. His right hand moved toward the inside of his jacket, and Naomi's body reacted before her mind caught up. She stepped back and sideways, chair screeching on concrete, documentation folder going with her, and Tae-jun's voice came across the warehouse floor like a blade. Don't. The sound of Tae-jun's gun clearing the holster was very specific. She knew the sound from the car. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Doshik and on what his hand was doing. Doshik's hand stopped with the weapon half drawn. The room was absolutely frozen. 12 men who had been in violence before, in this organization and others, and all of them had the particular stillness of people who were not going to move until the geometry resolved itself. Doshik looked at Tae-jun's gun. He looked at Naomi. He looked at the documentation on the table. He looked at the captains, at Lim, who was unmoved, at Song, who had declared himself, at Zhang, who had asked her to speak, at Ryu, who had been quiet for 2 hours and whose stillness was now the stillness of someone who has chosen. He looked at all of it, and she could see him looking at it, not calculating anymore, past calculation, just seeing it clearly for the first time in the way that you see things clearly when there's nothing left between you and them. He let the weapon slide back into the holster. The warehouse exhaled. Then Doshik straightened his jacket and looked at Tae-jun and said, with a flatness that had passed through anger and come out the other side into something almost like clarity, You think she's your strength. She is my strength, Tae-jun said. She's a liability. Everything she's given you tonight, she can take away. Everything a person gives you is something they can take from you. That's how you think about people, Tae-jun said. That's exactly how you think about people. That is why we are standing here. Doshik looked at him, at his nephew, who had run this organization for 4 years with a secret the organization didn't know, and a woman the organization had dismissed, and a child no one knew existed, and who was standing in the middle of a warehouse in the early hours of the morning with a gun in one hand and more of the room than Doshik had managed to take despite months of preparation. He sat down. Not in surrender. His posture didn't change. He sat down the way a man sits down when he's decided the field has shifted and the immediate battle is lost, but he hasn't decided anything else yet, and that distinction mattered, and Tae-jun knew it, and Naomi knew it, and she watched his hands settle on the table and she did not put her documentation folder down. Taejun looked at Park, who had come in behind them and taken a position along the warehouse's side wall. Park nodded. The confirmation of things handled, the gatemen gone, the estate secure, the 3 men in the kitchen awaiting disposition. Taejun looked at Captain Lim. I want a formal resolution from this room, tonight. You'll have it, Lim said. He looked at the other captains. Call for resolution. Documentation accepted as organizational record. Do-shik suspended from captaincy pending full financial audit by independent counsel. He didn't frame it as a question. He framed it as what it was. The senior member of the room using his seniority to move the room to a conclusion. The kind of authority that was only effective when it was exercised with certainty, and Lim had apparently decided his certainty. No one objected. In the silence that followed, Do-shik looked at Naomi across the table. Just looked at her. And she looked back at him and kept her hand steady and her face level, and she thought about a cellar room and a steel pipe and a small hand gripping the back of a jacket, and she thought about 11 days with an envelope on a kitchen counter and the word good, and what it meant and who she'd been before this and who she was becoming. Do-shik said, quietly enough that only she heard it, "You don't belong in this world." She looked at him steadily. "You're right," she said. "But I'm in it." She set the documentation folder on the table in front of Captain Lim, squarely and deliberately, and she straightened and stood with her hands at her sides and her breathing even, and she looked at the room, at the 12 men who had spent hours deciding what she was worth and what she represented and whether she was a liability or a truth, and she did not look away from any of them. Park moved to stand beside Do-shik's chair, quietly, without announcement, the way things that have been decided get executed in rooms like this. Not with ceremony, but with the simple movement of bodies enacting conclusions. Do-shik looked at the hand Park placed on the back of his chair, and then at Taejun, and Taejun looked back at him with the specific expression of a man who has nothing left to prove and is no longer angry, which is more frightening than anger. The Baiko Code, Taejun said, will be applied. 4 words. The room received them. Do-shik received them. And in the heavy silence of the warehouse, with the harbor dark outside the narrow windows and the crane. Somewhere along the dock, still running its slow mechanical work, the last thread of the night that had been building toward this pulled taut, and everything that was broken, and everything that was possible, and everything that had been chosen and paid for hung suspended in the moment just before it resolved, the moment before the weight comes down. The resolution, when it came, was not loud. That was the thing Naomi would remember later. Not the confrontation, not the warehouse's cold air, or the documents spread across the table, or Do-shik's face in the moment the room turned. What she would remember was how quiet it got afterward, how the silence had a different quality than the silence of threat, how it settled into the space the way cold water settles, finding the low places, filling them, becoming still. Park and 2 of the remaining loyal captains walked Do-shik out through the warehouse's side entrance at 1:23 in the morning. Do-shik went without physical resistance. His 2 large men had been moved from the building's perimeter before the resolution vote, Taejun's people, quietly, during the final deliberation. And there was no one left for him to signal to, no remaining geometry that worked in his favor, and Do-shik was, underneath everything, a man who had spent 30 years calculating odds. He understood when the calculation was finished. He didn't look at Naomi when he passed her. She had expected him to. She'd steeled herself for it, had a response prepared, had her face arranged for whatever version of his final shot at her that would be, had decided she would give him nothing in return. He walked past her like she wasn't there. That was worse somehow than anything he might have said. The erasure was more complete. She held herself still and watched him go and told herself the feeling in her chest was not what it felt like, which was a complicated grief for something she hadn't lost and wouldn't miss and couldn't quite name. Captain Lim came to stand beside her while the room was still reorganizing itself, still breathing itself back into something that resembled normalcy. I was a tall man for his generation, Lim, with the particular posture of someone who had carried weight for so long that it had become structural. He looked at the side door Do-shik had gone through, and then he looked at the documentation folder in Naomi's hands. "That's clean work," he said. "The archival log." She looked at him. He was not a man, she thought, who said things he didn't mean, and he was not saying this to make her feel better. He was saying it because it was accurate, and he believed in accuracy. "Thank you," she said. You understood what you were looking at before you understood what it meant. He glanced at her. That's a particular kind of intelligence. It doesn't always protect the person who has it. She wasn't sure if that was a warning or an observation. With Lim, she suspected the two were often the same thing. I know, she said. He nodded once and walked away. Taejun found her 20 minutes later, after the captains had dispersed, after the quiet conversations that followed a resolution like this one, the bilateral readings of what had happened and what it meant and what came next, the careful recalibration of 11 men who had witnessed something that would determine the shape of their lives inside the organization for years going forward. She was standing near the warehouse's narrow windows, looking at the harbor. The crane had stopped. The water was very still, catching container lights in long, broken reflections, the kind of reflection that looks like something trying to hold its shape against a current. He came and stood beside her. He didn't touch her. They stood there for a moment with the glass between them, and the night outside and the harbor doing what harbors do. Your shoulder, she said. It'll be fine. Let me look at it. Later. Taejun. Later, he said, not refusing, just placing it in the correct order of things. There are still things that need to be settled tonight. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the harbor, his profile carrying the particular exhaustion that had accumulated in a face over the course of a very long night of very high-stakes operation. Not the exhaustion that slackened features, but the kind that sharpened them, that made the underlying architecture visible. The jaw. The line from the eye to the temple, where he'd been holding tension for hours. The cut along his jawline had dried to a thin, dark line. Lee Sungwoo, she said. I know. He didn't choose to be in that room tonight. He was brought there. He's been held in a dependent relationship for 3 years because he couldn't get out of it and didn't have anyone offering him an alternative. She paused. He's a civilian. He witnessed something he didn't ask to witness, and then he got swallowed by it. Taejun was quiet for a moment. What are you asking? I'm asking what the Baeko Code says about someone who is used as a tool. Not a participant, a tool. He turned and looked at her. He looked at her for long enough that she understood he was taking the question seriously, not just hearing it. Nothing formal, he said. The code doesn't address that specific situation. Then you have discretion. I have discretion. Use it, she said. Not a demand, a request, offered with the full weight of everything they'd both just been through, with the specific authority of a person who had earned the right to make requests tonight. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he looked back at the harbor. He'll be relocated, Taejun said. Genuinely, this time, outside Korea, enough to start over. A pause. Not because of Doshik, because of what we just decided this organization is going to be. She breathed. Okay. Okay, he said. They stood together for a moment more, and then he straightened and turned from the window and said, Come on, let's go get our son. He said it naturally, without preamble or announcement. Our son. Like it was already true, because it was. Because it had been true since Minho put his small hand into hers in a warm bedroom doorway. Because biology was one way of making a family, and it was not the only way. And Kang Tae-jun, of all people, understood that the things you chose were more real than the things that simply happened to you. Naomi picked up the documentation folder and followed him out. The estate was still and dark when they arrived, the SUVs gone from the gate, the grounds quiet in the particular way that places are quiet after violence has moved through and left. Not peaceful, not yet, but emptied of its particular tension, beginning the slow process of becoming ordinary again. Huang met them at the gate. His split lip had swollen some in the hours since she'd last seen it, and he held himself with the careful posture of a young man managing pain while trying not to look like he was managing pain. The child is asleep, he said. I checked every 20 minutes. The 3 in the kitchen? Taejun asked. Park's people took them an hour ago. Taejun nodded. He put one hand briefly on Huang's shoulder, brief and unannounced, the gesture of a man who doesn't make it often and means it when he does, and went inside. Naomi followed him down the hallway to Minho's room. The door was still ajar, the way they'd left it, the thin bar of hall light along the bottom. Taejun pushed it open very gently, and they both stood in the doorway and looked. Minho was exactly as they'd left him, On his side, one hand under his cheek, the blanket pulled to his chin with the precision of a child who did this the same way every night. His breathing was the slow, reliable rhythm of deep sleep, and his face in sleep had the specific quality that children's faces have in sleep, which is the quality of absolute present tense. No past in it, no future, just the uncomplicated physical fact of right now, this breath, this moment. They stood there for a while. Tejan reached out and very slowly pulled the door to its original position, 3 inches ajar, the bar of light intact. And they moved away from the door and down the hall, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that would have added to what they just stood together looking at. She looked at his shoulder in the kitchen, because eventually, later arrives. He sat on the kitchen counter with his jacket off and his shirt pushed down his left arm, and she examined the shoulder with her fingers, pressing carefully along the joint line, watching his face, cataloging the places where the expression shifted. It was not dislocated. It was badly bruised, and the muscle had taken a significant impact and would take 10 to 14 days to become comfortable again, and he would be managing it for at least a week. And she told him all of this in plain practical terms while her hands did their careful work. He watched her face while she worked. "You've done this before," he said. "My father played rugby until he was 47, she said. Someone had to know what they were doing. "Where is he?" "Atlanta, retired, still opinionated." She pressed along the rear deltoid and watched him absorb it. "He's going to have a lot of questions about this situation." "Your mother?" "Passed. 8 years ago." She moved her assessment to the trapezius. "She would have had more questions than my father, and they would have been better questions." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "She would have liked you," Naomi said. She said it without decorating it, the way you say true things when you're too tired to be strategic about them. She had a thing for difficult men who meant what they said, thought most easy men were hiding something worse. Something moved through his expression that was not quite a smile but was in that direction. "Smart woman," he said. "The smartest." She stepped back and examined the shoulder from a slight distance. "You're going to ice it tonight and rest it tomorrow. That's not negotiable." "I have—" "Not negotiable," she said. "If I say it's useful, they comply." "But it's both," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "It's both." She turned her hand over in his and held it properly. What? 3 days passed. Not without consequence. There was no version of the aftermath of something like that which was without consequence, but with the specific exhausted productivity of people who have passed through the worst of a storm and are now dealing with what the storm left behind. Taejun spent most of the first 2 days in back-to-back conversations with the remaining captains, individually and in pairs, doing the work of re-establishment that follows a leadership challenge. Not triumphant, not punitive, just the patient, relentless work of rebuilding understanding, realigning trust, making visible the things that had been invisible before. He held those meetings with his shoulder iced under his jacket and his jaw still carrying the thin line of the cut and his voice steady throughout. Naomi managed the documentation archive's handover to the organizational council Lim had recommended, a process that took all of the first day and most of the second, and that required her to walk a very careful line between providing complete information and maintaining the kind of professional integrity that meant the work spoke for itself without requiring her to speak for it. She also called her firm in Atlanta. The conversation with her director there was complicated in the way that honest professional conversations often are. She explained that the contract was complete, that the archive was digitized, that she would be extending her stay in Seoul for personal reasons. And she answered his questions about the timeline of the completed work with the kind of thoroughness that made it clear the work had been done properly and the personal reasons were not his business. He was not entirely satisfied. She was not entirely concerned about his satisfaction. On the third day, she found Minho at the kitchen table when she came downstairs in the morning, sitting in front of a bowl of rice. He had apparently retrieved himself from the rice cooker that the estate's housekeeper kept perpetually full, and he was eating with a focused solemnity, and there was a small orange on the table beside the bowl that he had clearly intended to eat as well, but not yet gotten to. She sat across from him. He glanced up and then back at his rice. "You got your own breakfast," she said. He took another bite. Then, "I always do. The lady doesn't come until later." The housekeeper. who came mid-morning and left by early afternoon and had apparently been maintaining the estate's basic domestic order for years without being told very much about what the estate was being used for, because some kinds of professional discretion are cultivated by not asking questions.
"Do you want me to the orange?" Naomi asked. Minho considered this. "Yes," he said, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned the social performance of declining offers politely. She peeled the orange, she separated it into segments and put them on the edge of his bowl, and he ate them one by one while he finished his rice, and they sat in the kitchen in the morning light without speaking, and it was ordinary in a way that felt, under the circumstances, like an achievement. After a while, Minho said, without looking up, "Are you staying?" She looked at him. His eyes were on his bowl. His spoon moved in a small circle. "Yes," she said. He ate another segment of orange. "Okay," he said. It was the same word he'd said the first night, in the bedroom doorway, accepting her presence with the same plain trust. She thought about what it meant for a child to extend that kind of trust, what it required of the child, and what it asked of the person receiving it. She thought about what she was taking on and what she wasn't, and how you couldn't know the full weight of a decision in the moment you made it, but you made it anyway because the alternative was standing outside it, and standing outside it was its own kind of loss. She sat with Minho at the kitchen table until he finished his breakfast and put his bowl in the sink with the careful effortfulness of a child doing a task he'd been taught. And then he went to find his building blocks, and she poured coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the estate grounds in the October morning light, at the formal garden bare for the season, at the stone wall where she and Tai-jun had come through 3 nights ago, at the cellar door set into the east ground. She looked at all of it. She thought about a white envelope on a kitchen counter in Atlanta, about 11 days of looking at it every morning while the water heated, about the word irreversible in clinical black ink, and what she'd done with the evening she'd allowed herself after she read it, and how she'd gotten up from the bathroom floor and made tea, and begun thinking practically. Because that was what she did. Because it was the only thing she knew how to do with grief that she couldn't undo. She thought about how wrong she'd been about what irreversible meant. Not about the medical fact. That part was permanent and true, and she'd made her peace with it in stages over the past weeks. Not cleanly, not all at once, but genuinely. She'd made peace with it in the cellar, actually, she thought, sitting on that bottom step with Minho's weight against her side and the footsteps above and the cold concrete smell, holding a child she hadn't given birth to and hadn't known 3 weeks ago, and who had said okay in the dark of a warm bedroom and meant it with his whole body. What she'd been wrong about was the conclusion she'd drawn from the fact, the things she'd decided it meant about her future and what she had to offer and who deserved what. That had been wrong. Comprehensively, specifically, instructively wrong. She filed that away. Not as a wound, as information. The kind of information that changes how you navigate going forward. Tai-jun came down an hour later. He was moving carefully, favoring the shoulder in the small automatic ways of someone whose body has been told to rest and has partially complied. He poured coffee and stood beside her at the window, and they looked at the garden together. "Lim wants a formal reorganization of the captaincy," he said, using last week's events as the basis for restructuring some of the accountability mechanisms. "Is that good or bad?" "Good. Overdue." He drank his coffee. He also told me privately that he thinks the financial documentation should be shared with the regulatory audit team proactively, ahead of next quarter's review. Letting them find it is worse than bringing it forward. "He's right," she said. "Voluntary disclosure changes the legal posture significantly." "I know. I'm going to do it." He paused. "It means lawyers and regulators and a period of scrutiny that will be unpleasant." "Unpleasant but survivable," she said. "The alternative is worse." He nodded. They stood for a moment. The garden was very still. A bird landed on the bare branch of the plum tree near the wall, looked at nothing in particular, left. "Song came to see me yesterday," Tai-jun said. She waited. "He asked to remain as captain, formally. He understands it's my decision, and he made no argument except to say that he believed his judgment had been compromised in a specific way by a specific fear, and that he could account for that fear now that it had been named." He paused. He meant the succession question. He was afraid that without clarity on succession, the organization would fracture,
and Doshik offered him the appearance of clarity, which was false clarity, but was better than the real uncertainty he was sitting with. What did you tell him? That I'd consider it. He looked at the garden. I'm going to let him stay. With conditions. Conditions he agreed to before I said I'd consider it. You'd already decided. I'd already decided, he said. But a decision communicated before it's asked for is a gift. A decision made after consideration and conditions is a standard. She absorbed this. The particular pragmatism of how he operated, not coldly, but with the specific intelligence of a man who had learned that the symbols of a decision were often as important as the decision itself, and that running an organization required managing both. The child, she said, and then stopped, because she'd meant to say Min Ho, and something had shifted in how she referred to him internally that she hadn't fully processed yet. Min Ho, Taejun said, gently completing the correction she hadn't quite made. Min Ho, his grandmother in Busan. I spoke with her 2 days ago. She knows what happened, the general shape of it, not the detail. She asked one question. What question? She asked whether he was going to have parents. He paused. She didn't ask whether he was going to have a good life or a safe life or a prosperous life. She asked whether he was going to have parents. Naomi looked at her coffee cup. What did you tell her? I told her yes. He looked at her. I told her yes before I'd had the formal conversation. That's the second time I've gotten ahead of myself with you in the span of a week. I know, she said. I'm not apologizing for the answer, only for the sequencing. She looked up at him. I was watching her with the direct attention he gave to things that mattered to him, the quality of attention she'd noticed first in the records room when he'd stood at the door for almost a full minute before she'd realized he was there. Not surveillance, not calculation, just the complete focus of a man who was fully present for the things he chose to be present for. Ask me, she said. He set his coffee down. Will you help me become his father? He said. The same question he'd asked in the records room. The same words. But different now, not weighted by the complexity of what was coming, not shadowed by Doshik's meeting and the phone call that had arrived minutes later. Just the question itself, in the morning light, in a kitchen where a 5-year-old's empty bowl was still in the sink. Naomi set her own coffee down. Yes, she said. He exhaled once, not with relief, not with triumph, just the simple physical fact of a breath completed. She put her hand on the side of his face, carefully, below the cut. He turned into it slightly, the way people turn into contact when they've been tense for a very long time, and the tension has finally understood that it's allowed to release. They stood like that in the kitchen while the morning went about its business outside. The formal adoption process began 6 weeks later. It was not quick. It was not simple. Korean adoption law for domestic placements involved a sequence of steps that were each individually comprehensible and collectively overwhelming, and the fact that one of the prospective parents was a foreign national added a procedural layer that their attorney, a quiet woman named Bayek, who came recommended by Lim, and who asked exactly the right questions and none of the wrong ones, navigated with patience and no visible frustration. There were home visits. There were interviews. There were documents that required other documents. There was a period of supervised placement that required Naomi to be in Korea legally as a resident rather than as a contractor, which required a separate application and a different set of steps and approximately 6 weeks of bureaucratic correspondence that she handled herself. Because handling complex document systems under pressure was, as it turned out, her particular skill set, and she might as well use it. She called her father during the supervised placement period. Late evening Seoul time, early morning Atlanta time, the way they'd always done it when the distance was just professional, and not the specific weighted kind it was now. She told him the general shape of things, not everything. The version that was true without being the complete version. That she'd met someone, that the situation was complicated, that she was staying in Korea, that there was a child involved. Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Complicated how?" "In ways that are real," she said. "Not in ways I'm afraid of." Another pause. "Is he good to you?" "Yes." "The child?" "He's 5. He eats oranges with great seriousness. He builds things with blocks and then looks at them for a while and then builds something different." She paused. "He told me last week that my coffee smelled bad. He said it very kindly."
Her father laughed. It was a specific laugh she'd been hearing her whole life, startled out of him, the laugh he made when something caught him off guard, and he didn't have time to decide whether to be delighted or concerned, and delight won because it usually did with him. "Bring him to Atlanta," he said. "When things settle, bring them both." "I will," she said. She meant it. She added it to the category of things that were not yet but would be, a category that had been expanding steadily in recent weeks, filling with things she hadn't thought she'd have, and was now building toward with the same methodical focus she brought to everything. The night the adoption was finalized, it rained. It had been a long day. Signatures, a judge who asked Minho directly whether he understood what was happening, and received a solemn yes and a description of his new building block set that was not precisely responsive to the question but was received with appropriate judicial gravity. And by the time they were back at the estate, it was after 7, and Minho had fallen asleep in the car, with his cheek against Taejun's arm. Taejun carried him inside, and Naomi held the doors, and they put him to bed together, the same door left 3 inches ajar, the same bar of light along the bottom. They stood in the hallway afterward. The rain was audible on the estate's old roof. Not heavy, just steady, the kind of rain that settles in for the night. "He knew," Taejun said, in the car, before he fell asleep. He knew what today meant. "How do you know?" "He held on." He paused. "He usually falls asleep and lets go. Tonight he held on." She thought about that, about a 5-year-old boy holding on in his sleep, the deliberate unconscious grip of a child who has learned the difference between people who stay and people who don't, and has decided, in the way that children decide things, with the whole body rather than the mind, that these people were in the first category. She thought about what it cost a child to learn that distinction, about what it meant that he was still willing to reach the conclusion despite the cost. She thought about the grandmother in Busan, who had asked one question, whether he was going to have parents. "Is she all right?" Naomi asked. His grandmother. "Stable. The facility is good. I'll take him to see her in the spring. I think she should know him. I think she deserves that." "She does," Naomi said. They stood together in the hallway, with the rain on the roof and the thin bar of light under Minho's door. "The organization," Naomi said after a while. Not as a question exactly, more as the beginning of something she'd been thinking about for weeks. "Tell me," he said. "The financial restructuring, the regulatory disclosure, the captaincy reorganization." She turned to look at him. "You said something in the warehouse that night after Doshik left. You said the code you'd built was about what the organization was going to be, not what it had been." "Yes." "I want to be part of that," she said, "not in the records room, not as a contractor who notices things and documents them. Something else." She paused. "The legitimate side. Beko Logistics is a real company with real operations. If it's going to operate the way you're saying it will, with actual compliance structures, with real regulatory relationships, then the financial architecture needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. Not patched, rebuilt." He looked at her. "I know what's in those records," she said. "I know where the structural problems are and what they look like, and how to build something that doesn't have those problems. That's not arrogance. That's 7 months of very close reading." She held his eyes. "I'm not asking for a title or a position. I'm saying I want to do the work." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she let herself consider the possibility that he would say no, that he would have reasons, structural reasons, reasons about optics or organizational dynamics, or the particular complications of having a partner also function in a professional capacity, and that those reasons might be valid, and she would accept them if they were. "When do you want to start?" he said. She breathed. "After Minho's first week of school. He starts on the 14th. That's 3 weeks." "I know. I have some things to finish first." "What things?" "I need to go to Atlanta," she said. "I need to bring my father here. I need him to see this, all of it, as much as I can show him, before I'm fully in. He needs to be able to say yes to this too. Not because I need his permission, because he's my father, and this is the rest of my life, and he deserves to understand what he's saying yes to." Taejun looked at her with the expression she'd come to know as his version of being moved. Not the demonstrative version, not the performed version, but the real one, which was very still and very direct and lived mostly in his eyes. "Bring him," he said. "I'll make sure he's comfortable." He's going to ask you questions, she said. Hard ones. He was a high school history teacher for 31 years. He asks questions for a living. Good, Taejun said. The same word. The one she'd built a new life around. She looked at him, and she thought about the records room and the envelope on the kitchen counter and the white text of a clinical verdict that had seemed, at the time, like the end of something. She thought about 11 days of not opening it and what she'd been afraid of and what had actually been inside. And she thought about how the story you tell yourself about what something means is a separate document from the thing itself, and you can choose to read them differently. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested against the wall. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, the house breathed around them. The old stones of it, the warm rooms of it, the child sleeping 3 inches behind a door ajar for light. It breathed the way houses do when they've been claimed by people who intend to stay in them, when the rooms have stopped being temporary and started being specific. This kitchen, this hallway, this bar of light that means someone is watching, someone is close, the night is outside and you are inside, and that is not luck but choice, repeated daily, which is what a home is made of. Taejun turned his hand over under hers and held it. The Baeko name had been many things in its history: a currency of fear, an inheritance of violence, a burden carried by men who hadn't chosen it and couldn't set it down. It had moved through 3 generations like a fault line, invisible, load-bearing, capable of destruction with enough pressure. What it became next was not inevitable. Nothing about it had been inevitable. Not Minho in his warm room, not the documents that had told a truth that changed the room's arithmetic, not Naomi standing in a Korean hallway in the rain holding the hand of a man who had told her the truth about his worst fear and waited to see what she would do with it. None of it was inevitable. All of it was chosen. That was the thing that mattered. That was the thing she would carry forward into the rebuilt financial architecture, and the 3 weeks in Atlanta and the conversation with her father and Minho's first day of school and every complicated ordinary day that followed. Not that it had worked out, that they had chosen it, specifically. At every juncture where choosing was possible, at every moment when the easier thing would have been to fold. They had chosen it anyway, and the rain fell on the old estate outside the capital city, and inside the house held everything it was trusted to hold.